So we've brought together a distinguished panel of educators to address the question of what schools need for what the type of schools that our children deserve. In this current educational climate, one of the big buzzwords is accountability. And so we have our own measures of accountability as to how successful this evening's program will be. To make a point about one of our two criterias, I'd like to describe for you a little bit about holidays with my family. I come from a family of teachers, social workers, and other people who consider themselves to be experts in education. And so whenever we get together for a holiday dinner, the topic always turns to debating about educational issues. What kids should be reading, how schools should look, charter versus traditional public schools, single-gender schools, and I'm anticipating in a few weeks when we get together for Easter that first in, last out, or whatever will be a new topic added to our repertoire over heated discussions at the dinner. Now, I applaud my family for doing this, for feeling the importance of this, but somehow it feels as though we never get past the positions that we had last year or the year before. And so my point is this: we're hoping that tonight that this conversation will allow us to move past what we've always thought about. We didn't come here tonight to confirm our convictions, but actually to hear somebody else's ideas. One of my favorite talk shows in the morning is Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough. I don't know if any of you ever watched it. But at the end of the show, they always ask, so what did you learn today? And we're hoping that today you'll learn a little bit more about different points of view, because the idea is not just to stick to what we believe, but to explore different solutions that are best for our kids. We have one other criteria to judge the effectiveness of tonight's session. And that one is easier to measure because it could be measured in dollars and cents. We're hoping that after you've had an opportunity to hear Kari talk about Brosis, that you will encourage friends to learn more about us. Ask some of the young people who are here tonight, the board members, the staff, to invite you to come up to our brownstone so you can get a better sense of what we can do. And of course, we're always willing to accept donations or connect us with your friends who are willing to make donations. So now I have the honor of introducing our founder and executive director, Kari Lazar-White, someone who is always learning as well as teaching and leading. Kari is in the broader Harlem community seen as a bit of a rock star. And also in the educational community. It's true. He'll be doing autographs afterwards, by the way. But for those of you who are new to us tonight, I'd like to share with you a little bit about his background. Kari is a social entrepreneur, educator, nonprofit executive, writer, and attorney. In 1995, he co-founded the Brotherhood Sister Soul, an award-winning national recognized comprehensive youth development and education organization. He's been recognized with an array of awards from Oprah Winfrey, the Ford Foundation, the Fund for the City of New York State's Department of Education, Abyssinian Development Corporation, Brown University, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the Sherman Sterling, which supported his legal studies. Kari has edited and contributed to assorted publications and curricula for Brotherhood Sister Soul, and his essays have been published by Nation Books, Essence Magazine, the Vineyard Gazette, After School Matters, and New York University in an article which is coming out shortly. He's been a featured panelist and speaker at conferences hosted by such institutions as Harvard University, assorted campuses at City University of New York, University of Florida, Open Society Institute, W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Urban League, Heinz Endowments, National Principals Leaders Institutes, and more. He serves on the board of advisors for Heinz Endowment for Black Male Initiative and the National Board of Advisors for the Susan L. Taylor National Cares Mentoring Movement. Kari received his bachelor's degree from Brown University and his Juris Doctorate from Yale University. And most importantly, I feel as though Kari is somebody who is an inspiration for us as one of the key ingredients in what's needed to make our schools better. Someone who has high expectations for kids as well as high amount of care for the children under his jurisdiction. So it's now my honor to introduce to you our Executive Director, Kari.
I want to talk to you all just for a few minutes about the work of Brotherhood Sister Soul, what it is that we do, and what we've learned that I think is applicable for our conversation this evening. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to see a brief documentary that poses questions to our panelists from our young people. Brotherhood Sister Soul at its core is about developing the voices of young people, about providing a space for them to comment on the world. And so how can we have this conversation on education this evening without the voices of our young people in the room? And so we're fortunate to have that, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Brotherhood Sister Soul, we are a comprehensive youth development organization based in Harlem. We work with young people from the age of 8 until 22, and we provide scaffolded multi-service programming. It's evidence-based, and it goes deep. And what I mean by that is that we provide support and guidance and love to young people over a long term, helping to guide them on the path towards adulthood. We teach discipline, we teach a sense of self-order, and we teach very intensive political education to understand the root causes of the issues that they face. Once we're done with that process, we then try to open doors for them, providing true access and opportunity in their life. The Brotherhood Sister Soul engages in no sifting at all. Any young person who wants to be a part of our program can be a part of our program. And so young people come to us from stable families. They come to us kind of on the right path, and we help to continue them on that path. And some come from some of the most desperate situations one can imagine in this city. Brotherhood Sister Soul exists on 143rd Street in West Harlem, in the center, the epicenter of a 1 mile square block radius where the NYPD estimates that 90% of the cocaine in the city of New York moves through. The average per capita income for a family of 4 is $22,000 in that community. It is an environment that can be toxic to our young people. And as people committed, as so many of us are in this room, to the education of our young people, we consider it, number one, a travesty that our young people have to exist and come up in that type of environment. And number two, we believe it's our responsibility to ensure that they can overcome it. So first, we try to help our young people understand the conditions they are born into, understand how to navigate out of them, and then to build long-term successful lives. And so part of that is about exposure. It's about taking young people to study in Africa and Latin America. It's about rites of passage programming that helps them define what it means to be men and women, leaders in their community, sisters and brothers. It's about providing college access and high school support, home counseling, and legal representation. It's about art programming and athletic programming. It's about anything we can do to engage, to inspire, and to teach young people. And what we feel we've learned over the last 15 years is that that is the only approach that truly works for helping young people transform their life. And what I mean by that is if we look at the community of Harlem right now, we have 34% of black and Latin men graduating from high school within 4 years, and 40% graduating at all from high school, whereas 88% of Brotherhood Sister Soul alumni are graduating from high school. So that's an educational outcome. And if we look at building long-term stable lives, right now, because of the economic environment, 30% of 18 to 25-year-olds in Harlem are either in college or employed full-time. Again, only 30% are employed full-time or in college, whereas 95% of our alumni are. And so we look at that as an outcome. If we want our young people to be able to compete in the world today, they have to learn skills in an academic environment that allows them to compete. It simply can't be about a test. It simply cannot be about a narrow understanding of what education means, but it has to be the kind of education that's actually rampant in our city. And we can look at our independent schools. We can look at many of our Catholic schools. We can look at many of our public schools. That's what a good education looks like. And our argument is that all young people deserve that it's our responsibility to live up to the state constitution, which says that all young people should receive a common level education. And while I think we can all talk about a lot of the difficulties with the educational system, I doubt anyone would say that all young people in New York City receive a common level education. So the question is, how do we get there, and what do we need to do to help young people to get there? We believe again, that it's about creating an interactive, popular form of education for young people that's also traditional in its same way. It's about helping young people build a stable environment where they can feel supported, but then also reach out and ask questions broader than their own existence, that they will have a responsibility once they reach that level to contribute back into their home communities. And because we've seen so many young people overcome their realities, what we've learned as an underlying lesson of our youth development work over the last 15 years is this: that there is no one answer, that there is no so-called silver bullet. And our viewpoint is when people start talking about one thing that will transform our schools, that inherently is a person who's not serious about educational reform. That if we start talking about one type of school as the answer, that is somebody who's not serious about educational reform. Our young people attend charter schools, public schools, Catholic schools, in a few cases, private schools. All of them are coming from the same community that I described at the beginning of my comments. And there are great inherent strengths in the community of Harlem and the South Bronx, but there are also all too many pitfalls. And so when we start talking about young people transforming their life, and folks start talking about this is the one answer, this is the silver bullet, it's disingenuous to the conversation of education. And so if after 15 years, through comprehensive support, we've been able to help young people transform their lives, our belief, our philosophy, is what we need to look at as transformative change in our school system, with our schools, and with our young people. The video that we're going to see today comes from an alumni member of our program, Frank Lopez, who graduated from high school, went off to college, first in his family to go to school, graduated from NYU as a film student, and has made an array of films for Brotherhood Sister Soul. And in the interest of this panel, what we asked him to do was to interview 3 of our alumni, 3 of our active members, and ask them, what does your education mean to you? What do you want to see in your schools? And so he sat down with them, he talked with them, and the result was a 7-minute short documentary that you'll see that will open up our panel today. It's called My Education.
Personally, I think a quality education is just when the student wakes up. You have school 5 days a week. When the student wakes up on Monday, everybody is usually tired. I got to go to school and everything. That student can wake up and say, oh my gosh, I want to go to school. Grab my bags out 30 minutes before he's supposed to be there. Running to school, could walk in, greeted by, staff that's there. They know him, or her. They walk into class, they're ready for that. Why? Because their teacher's up there. They already got the lesson. All right, I'm ready to teach you guys. Let's go. Yeah, I'm excited on Monday at 8 in the morning.
The first thing I would change is, I think it's extremely important for teachers to have that bond, that connection with the students. Students will go the extra mile if you have that connection. Just knowing that somebody is rooting for you, and what kid would want to disappoint somebody that they look up to, that really cares for them. So just that connection, school shouldn't have to feel like, you shouldn't have to feel like that you're just going to school. It should be inspirational. You should be rejuvenated by the time you leave.
You understand as a high school student, I need to pass these tests. I need to get my high school diploma. I need to go to college. These are all, but it's almost like a dogma. It's almost like it just is. Okay, this is what we're supposed to do. I think it's important to have that human, something is based just like a human connection, The reality is, like, when you're dealing with students, you're dealing with human beings. And when you're talking about teaching, you're talking about a relationship, teacher-student relationship.
Be a counselor, be hands-on, be wholehearted with the student. If the student is learning and is willing to learn and is excited about learning, then that should inspire the teacher to teach.
My ideal teacher would be a teacher that would be passionate to teach, period. To teach anybody, it doesn't matter. They should be passionate and teach us what we want to learn too. besides the lesson plans that they have originally for us. And also, like I said before, current events.
Connect the curriculum.
Yeah, basically.
I want young people to know that they can be in a school that understands that they learn in very different ways, that some of them need for it to be played to music to get it, that some of them need rooms where they can touch and feel and experiment, where some people just need a space where they can write and write and write and write and write, where all these visual things are happening, where they're going outside the classroom and taking trips and making connections.
I think I had a really good balance with my after-school program with the Brotherhood Sister Soul that I feel like a lot of my peers missed out on. Like just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was in church and my pastor was ranting about how a lot of young people haven't seen Roots. And he was saying like, oh, you guys are missing out. Like, I think it's really important for people to understand where they come from, especially in America. And I was like, yeah, like he was really making a big deal about watching the movie. But like just a few years ago in my junior year, I had got the opportunity to go to Ghana and actually stand in the slave dungeon. Now, I wouldn't be able to compare sitting down watching a movie to standing in the slave dungeon. So like that was real humbling for me to know that a lot of my peers aren't blessed with the opportunities that I had outside of school, like my extracurricular activities.
Quality after school, not 3 to 4. That's not a quality after school. And not, or you have tutoring from 3 to 4, then if you have time for after school, you go. No. You can mix tutoring with your after school. Certain days you could do tutoring, other days you can have your after school, or in sports that, not just sports, different classes of course, but things that are offered at other specialty schools in public schools. Public schools are for the public who cannot make it to that specialty school, so why can't they have the exact same thing specialty school has?
To walk in school and have all doors open. To walk in my school and have my teachers, have the staff of the school say, hey, Mr. Sanchez, what you want to do? What you want to do? Which doors you want to walk into? How can I help you get there? What are your goals after high school? What do you need?
A quality education needs to be well-rounded. It shouldn't be just school. You know, for teenagers, they are just starting out. You know, they haven't even seen the world. I think it's important that students have a vision. They see things full circle. You just can't just blindly put somebody in a room and expect them to know where they're going.
The way it's set up, so you say, okay, it's on the students. So at the end of if a student wants to learn, they'll learn, because out of these 30 kids, there's always 5 that make it to do great things, right? So okay, so it's not on the students. But then you say, what? But then it's on the teacher. But then you have to consider the teacher have like 30 kids, sometimes 30, they have other things going on. Sometimes there's teachers, high school teachers that have students that are special ed or have IEP, individual education plans. So you have a student that's considered special ed because he has maybe learning disabilities, and it's another student who's special ed because he has behavior issues. And you have them in the same classroom, and then you have a student that's really advanced, and you have all of this going on. The teacher's forced to teach many different lessons within one lesson. So one class becomes it's almost like a juggling act, like, you understand? So you have to explain the same things in different ways. So is it the teacher's fault? You know? And then on top of that is like maybe you don't have the space. Kids, there's other issues going on. You have to prepare them for certain tests. Like, so, like, whose fault is it? And the only thing that I think we can all agree on is basically maybe the structure, the way it's set up. You know, like something it's bigger than just students and teachers. Maybe the way we expect the relationship to play out.
I would want all children who are receiving a public school education to know that they're getting the best, and the best is being had by their friends who are going to the school across the street, up the block, and in the state next door to theirs. I want for young people to know that they're going to be cared for and educated by people who don't just have a passion to be educators, but people who are well prepared and have the skills and are continuing to develop those skills to provide the best education. I want them to know that they're going to be in the school that's going to wrap around their needs. So really address them as a whole person, not just you need to ace this test, you need to get a 3 or 4 here for you to go to the next level. But it's going to make sure that you have a space to be early in the morning. If your parents work early and you need to be dropped off and have a healthy breakfast, that you can get that at your school. That if you need to get lunch, that you can get a healthy lunch at school. That you can get after school care that's not just about babysitting, but that's really going to be enriching and is really going to make the connections between what you're learning in the classroom and what you need to learn to be successful in life, however you define success for yourself.
I want to walk into my school and have the opportunity every other student has. I want to walk into my school and I want to say this is fair. That's what a quality education is for me.
As the panel comes up and the latecomers come in and grab seats, there's one other, I guess, framing comment I would want to give for the panel. This echoes something that Peter said earlier, and that is that Brotherhood Sister Soul, when we sit around at staff meetings and we have conversations, we always say that every decision we make needs to be in the interest of our young people. That it's about young people and their development, that it's not about our own personal agendas as staff members, our own strengths, our own weaknesses, but it's about the comprehensive development of our young people, and what's best for them is what's best for the Brotherhood Sister Soul. And so as we talk about educational issues today, I just encourage the panelists to remember those voices that we just heard from, to remember their comments, and that the framing of our conversation this evening is what is in the best interest of our young people, the young people of the city of New York, the young people who tend overwhelmingly our public school system, and what would it take to truly provide a fair, as XCL said, or equal education. To moderate our panel, I'll introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our panelists. Pedro Noguera is a board member at the Brotherhood Sister Soul. He is the executive director at the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education and a professor of both education and sociology at NYU. He's an urban sociologist who focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, and he is somebody who, in his own research, looks quite honestly and comprehensively at the issues of urban education. He's the author of over 150 articles, 5 books. He's a commentator on CNN and NPR, and was a member of President Obama's educational transition team. And in addition, is a friend, a colleague, and somebody we could not think of a better person to put this panel in their hands than Dr. Noguera. Pedro.
Good evening. Can you hear me? So it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator, and we've assembled a very impressive panel, and their bios, full bios, are in the brochure that you've been given. So I'm not going to read the full bio, but I will invite them up with just explaining the titles. I'll start with Richard Bury. Richard is the president and CEO of the Children's Aid Society, which has been doing comprehensive work in supporting children in schools in New York City for many, many years. Dr. Michelle Fine, distinguished professor of psychology at the Graduate Center of CUNY, author of many books, well known throughout the country. Come on, good friend. Thanks, y'all. Shale Polako-Sharansky. Shale is the Chief Academic Officer of New York City Department of Education, supporter of Brotherhood Sister Soul, and we are glad to have you here tonight, Shale. Should add, Shale's also been the principal and founder of several schools here in New York City. Fernanda Santos, the education reporter for the New York Times. Brazilian by birth, New Yorker by choice. And finally, Dr. Lester Young, Regent at Large, former Deputy Superintendent for New York City, and also a long-standing experienced educator. Thank you all.
Good.
Thank you all for being part of this. So I think our goal, we've heard it from Peter, we've heard it from Kari, is to try to use this as a conversation to shed light on complex issues. And we know that education gets a lot of attention now. Even we got so many other issues competing for time and attention. The economy, the wars, education keeps right there at the top of the list. And I think it's because so many people understand that what happens in education ultimately is going to determine what kind of society we live in. So I want to start with you, Regent Young, if you don't mind, down at the end. Lester?
Sure.
You're sitting there on the board as someone who's come from New York City, knows well what's happening on the ground, and you know, have a sense that these changes in graduation requirements that New York State's about to implement are going to have some pretty profound impacts on students here in New York City. As a regent, what could you tell us we should know, and what should we be concerned about with respect to this change in policy?
Well, the first thing is that the idea of raised standards, and I would imagine everyone in the audience agrees with the idea of higher standards seem to make sense in the world that we live in. However, what I would side on is that it doesn't make sense for us to raise standards unless we are providing the means for young people to meet those standards. And so what I struggle with constantly is the fact that we know that for large segments of our population, they have not met the current lower standards. And so the question that I raise constantly is, well, what's going to be different? What are we going to put in place to ensure that more young people, particularly students of color, can meet these new, more demanding standards? So, for example, we know that in order to have better completions, you have to have stronger beginnings. And so one of the things that we've talked about, and again, this is a political struggle, but it's something that the public needs to get behind. How do we ensure that all of our young people have access to high quality preschool experiences? I mean, we know in New York, those of you who teach in elementary schools know that a large segment of your population, they don't arrive until they get to the first grade. And they come in with lots of challenges, and yet in 2 years they're required to take state tests. We know that we have to do a better job of ensuring, and I'm going to use a word that was used earlier, this notion of common, but we've got to ensure that all young people have access to high-quality curriculum that's coherent and articulated up and down the P16 spectrum. And that's designed to ensure that young people can be successful at the next level, and also a curriculum that respects and values who the young people are, their culture, their traditions, their values. Of course, we need teachers who know their content. They have to know how to teach, but more importantly, they need to know, and I think the students said it that were interviewed, they need to know the children and students they're teaching and how they learn. They have to be prepared to make a personal investment in the lives of young people. Just a point of commentary, I talked to a youngster recently and said to her, well, what was special about your school? And she said, well, you know, in this school, in my school, we were like a family. She said that if I have a problem, I can call my teacher at night. Now, that's a very special place. And so what I think our young people are saying is that it's important that we in schools demonstrate that we care, we're concerned, and we're committed to their development.
Lester, can I just follow up, though? So, given what you know about where we are, what is the state doing? What are the regions thinking? Because they are going to adopt these higher standards. Yeah. What are we going to do to prevent a catastrophe?
See, I think that's the challenge. And without divulging...
Oh, you got a secret plan. Okay.
Well, you know, for example...
That's reassuring.
You know, one of the recommendations, and again, we're waiting to see if it made it into the budget. We've said that schools need to be open longer, And so one of our proposals is that schools now operate for 200 days a year for 8 hours a day. We believe that's important. But along with that, it's also important how you use the time. So if all we're going to do is use the 200 days the way we're using them now, and we're going to use the 8 hours the way we use the current 5 hours or 5 hours and 20 minutes, then we're not going to accomplish anything. So I think that it's not just one strategy, it's got to be multiple strategies.
Let me get Michelle into the conversation, because Michelle, you've been studying this from as a researcher, as a scholar. I know you've worked in several schools. Are there things that you're seeing from your standpoint as someone who's going in and probing these issues that you think maybe policymakers may not see and should see?
Nothing that I will say was not said in the film, although I've been hanging out in schools for 30 years. What I heard was one young man saying, open all the doors and say, which road do you want to walk down? What I heard was another young person say, I want to walk into a school and say, this is fair. So for me, the question is, I'm going to be positive. There are many things I'm worried about, and I'm worried about, just as you said, Lester, kind of increasing the standards without creating the capacity in the schools for young people to reach it. I live in New Jersey, where New Jersey is the #2 graduation rate in the country. New York is number 48. I worry a lot about the consequences of high-stakes tests when we haven't provided the supports for young people or educators to deliver on them. And I particularly worry for young people of color, immigrant youth, youth who have special ed concerns. So what was the question? What needs to be in place?
Are you seeing some things that...
I'm still answering Lester,
Okay.
and I want to know what... Yeah, go ahead.
So is there something that maybe our policymakers need to pay attention to that they are not focusing on?
Okay, I got 4 ideas.
Okay.
I got 4 ideas. Are you writing this down? I'll leave it. So one is, accountability was our word. We all wanted schools that were accountable to youth and to communities and to teachers and to parents. I don't know who took it. But we meant like a thick sense of accountability. So I would hope that the state would get creative about multiple strategies for assessing young people's work, right? New York City enjoys the Performance Assessment Consortium. Throughout the state, there are varieties of ways to meet the state standards. They've done research on how well do those kids do in college. They do very well. And what they know how to do, which is an issue I haven't heard, is they know how to revise. Revision is a really important tool. And when you're only assessed on a test and you don't see the data ever, really, you don't learn how to revise. And they also know how to rely on adults when they hit a bump in the road. So my first thing is a broad sense of assessment and accountability. My second is I wish we had the desire to create a nation of writers. Right? I don't think young people are writing a lot in schools. And, writers create great sons, right? Jane Lazar is an amazing writer. So I wish that we had more deep sense of writing. I wish there was more conversation about equity. I am not hearing conversations about equity. How are young people's bodies distributed in schools? Unfortunately, New York, we now have more segregation than we have had. There are too many new schools that have selective criteria or throw kids out, so we're more segregated. It's a real problem that English language learners are being corralled into gated communities or special education schools, and then we declare those schools broken and close them. So I worry a lot about the distribution of young people and the distribution of educators. I won't ask how many of us have nieces or young women in our lives who are teaching special ed science in the Bronx with 5 minutes of training during the summer. But I do, and lots of us do, and they're dedicated young people. So I worry that we're not equitably distributing experience. I worry a lot about the assault on teachers and unions. So equity, accountability, and a simple old-fashioned notion of democracy. I worry these days that parents, community, youth, and teachers are feeling just disrespected in their schools. When I go to a school and I see young people as excited as they are at Brosis, where I had the pleasure of being the other day, it's just stunning. And I've done this for 30 years. Young people are dying to be educated. They have such a high yearning to be challenged. They want to read hard books if somebody can help them get there, right? They want to write hard papers if somebody will give them feedback. How many of you are teachers? All right, so I don't have to tell you, right? They're barnacles after the kind of attitude thing. They, you know, like if you show that you care about them, they so want to attach. And so they deserve dignity, democracy, a strong sense of accountability, and a strong sense of equity. And I worry that we are walking away from all of those.
Okay, thank you. Fernanda. Fernanda, I know you're at the New York Times and relatively new to the education beat. And as a reader of the Times, I've noticed a change in the coverage. It seemed like during the early part of the Bloomberg years that all was good in New York City public schools. And just in the last few years, it seems like the Times taken on a more critical stance. And I'm wondering, so your take on that, is that an accurate reading, or is that just my own subjective?
I think it's an accurate reading,
okay,
yes.
so what would explain that, and what do you think, what is the media's role in holding our policymakers accountable for what's happening in our schools?
The answers are connected, but the reasons are what they lead to are different things, and all of it has to do with who's driving the coverage, right? So, unfortunately, when you look around the New York Times newsroom, and without due respect to Shale, who does great work, when you look around the Tweed Courthouse, for example, you don't see a lot of people like you or me. You know, it's a pretty sort of white world that we live in newspapers, in policy at City Hall, and given that this very one-sided perspective of the world sort of takes over, in the Times there was, as in other papers, there was this shift, very deep shift on the education coverage towards politics, and they became very, very connected. It's on one hand, it's a good thing to always look at things critically. I think we always have to, because the world's not perfect, as much as I would love for it to be. But on the other hand, I think that what has been lost, and that's what has been a struggle, I think, of many reporters, and it's what's been lost in coverage in general, is this perspective that comes from people who see things differently, to people, from people to whom the politics, yes, is important because it affects their daily lives, but also to whom other parts of the puzzle are more important, like, do I have enough food at home to, go to school with a full belly and be able to sit through several hours of class? Or do I have parents who speak the language and are able to help my little sister and brother with their homework? Or am I going to have to take over that role and then help mom make dinner and then do my homework and then study for the SAT and then go to bed at 2 in the morning and have to get up early because I have to drop off my brother and sister in school and then go to my class, So there's a lot of that has been lost, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, there is a very sort of kind of laser focus from this, the newspaper's perspective on the very deep connections between education and politics. And sadly, I think from the perspective of reporters, the fact that a lot of them never had experiences that are very different. So when you have a lot of people who sort of grew up all in the same way and they are trying to understand how other people live, a lot of people are able to do that, but I think that there's always something that is lacking, and it's that understanding that, it's more than just working really hard to get things done. There's more that needs to be there. And then I think that that's what, as far as the media coverage of education has been sort of lacking, in my opinion.
So to kind of flesh out those other ingredients.
Yes, because in my opinion, it's all connected. You know, you can't look at the schools as just one isolated part of a young person's life. It's just everything is very much connected, and I don't see how you can expect much of people in school if at home and in the neighborhoods they live in, there's a lot that is lacking, and that there's a lot that when they go back home to that they would like to have access to and they don't. And that's what I think creates a very big separation within the 1,600 or so schools that we have in the city, as far as, you know, the kids who do really, really well, and those who, you know, sometimes even though they work really hard, they don't really achieve that same level.
Well, that's a good segue to Richard. Richard, Children's Aid Society has been trying to address all those other issues that Fernanda mentioned a moment ago, probably longer than most groups in New York. What lessons have you learned about doing that work and having an impact in those most challenged, most distressed communities?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Pedro and Fakara, the opportunity to be here with you all today. I already told Cara I was feeling a little outclassed by this panel, but I'm going to do my best not to embarrass myself. So what have we learned at the Children's Aid Society? I mean, what I would say first, and it's great to be on the panel with you. We haven't met before, but know a lot about your work. I mean, what I would say first is that I think folks can, for various reasons, support or not support a lot of the educational policies we've seen under Mayor Bloomberg and under Chancellor Klein and presumably under Chancellor Black. And there's stuff that I believe in and stuff that I don't as much, let's say. But one thing that I very strongly have really embraced that this administration has done is sort of forever put to bed the myth that somehow poor children and low-income children can't learn and shouldn't be expected to learn. I'm reading a book right now that I'm just about halfway through that I would recommend by David Kerp, called Kids First, which is all about 5 ideas for children in America. And I'm a little biased because one of the ideas features the work of the Children's Aid Society, but even if that weren't true, it's a good book. But I only say that because I don't want to steal the quote, but he says that the smartest thing that George Bush ever said, President George W. Bush ever said, is when he talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. And I think whatever else you can say, the reforms by this administration, by some of the charter schools and others in the educational reform movement have been really working to put to bed forever the soft bigotry of low expectations, the idea that you can't somehow impact education until you solve the issue of poverty. So I support that, but I have a but to it, which is sort of the core of how I would address the question, which is, although it's absolutely clear that poor children, low-income children in quality schools can, should, and will learn, it's also true that poverty has a lot to do with where children are and the barriers they face to learning. And I imagine this room doesn't need a lot of exposition on the way that it works. But it goes across the gamut. It starts from health issues, low-income children who experience asthma at alarming rates, and other factors that keep them out of the classroom in the first place. They can't even come to the classroom, which are highly correlated with poverty and living in high-poverty communities. We know that the way that Regina Young was just talking about young people being prepared for school, and we know that young people start school behind for a variety of reasons. They start school behind because they've been exposed to fewer words, less rich language. They're less likely to have had enriching preschool opportunities. Or they're more likely to suffer low birth weight and other types of challenges in early childhood that have an impact on their cognitive development. We know that they're more likely to come from high-stress environments and just frequent transitions in housing and overworked parents who are trying to put food on the table. They're more likely to have seen and experienced traumatic violence, things like in my life, if I thought that my children would see, we would be spending every week in therapy because of the kind of traumatic violence that so many of our children take for granted. And we know that all these things serve as very real barriers to learning. You know, in New York City, 1 out of every 5 elementary school students misses 30 days or more of school. It's 1 in 3 in neighborhoods like Central Harlem, the South Bronx.
1 out of 3 days of school?
Yeah, yes, miss one. Yes. I'm sorry. 1 out of 3 children. I'm sorry, miss 30 days or more of school.
Gotcha.
I know that would be very
That'll be a
bad.
bit much.
But that's pretty bad.
That's
So
still
1 in
pretty
3
bad.
children to meet 30 or more days of school, and I don't care how great the school is. You've got to be there and prepared to learn. You have to have parents who have the knowledge and the resources and the space to be supporters in their education.
So your Children's Aid is in how many schools?
So the
You
Children's
have
Aid
full
Society,
service schools?
we work in 20 community schools in New York, and what I would say to the answer to the question is, what we've learned are that to be effective in reaching children and supporting children, particularly low-income children, we think of, we've, since the last 25 years, operated what we call full-service community schools in New York City, as well as operated something called the National Center for Community Schools, which does technical assistance to school districts around the world. And essentially, our schools feature things like early childhood education integrated in the school building. So kids are coming to school from birth and preschool experiences located in the school building, enriching after-school and summer programs, school-based health clinics, including not only medical and dental health, but mental health clinics and parent engagement and parent education programs. But we feel that by providing that kind of support in the school buildings, we can really create institutions where not only most children can learn, but where all children can learn, because we can begin to address the very real barriers that stand in the way of great teachers being able to teach effectively. And so what I would say, what we've learned, what we want to do is we want to increase those investments, that every school should be a community school, that we should invest in early childhood education so that children come to school in kindergarten ready. Somehow our world, we've decided in America that children start learning at 5. And this is a barrier created by adults, created by policymakers. It has nothing to do with children and what children need to develop. We need to expand after-school programs. I saw Bill Chong here, and New York City has done such incredible work to build an infrastructure around after-school programs and summer programs, enriching after-school and summer programs, and we're about to watch that be fundamentally dismantled. We know what we have to do. The question, as always, is do we have the will to do it?
All right, so that takes us to Shell. And Shell, you are the Chief Academic Officer, some might say the leading educator here in New York City. Not to say that your boss is not an educator now, but but you're the one who has the title as the Chief Academic Officer. You have experience as a principal, as a founder of schools. You've seen what works. You've seen what doesn't work. What do you think we should be doing in New York City to create more successful schools than we have right now? Because I'm in schools a lot throughout the city. I'm often struck by the fact that even in some of the most difficult communities, we have some schools that are gems, right? That show us it can be done when we put all the ingredients in place. And then that gets me thinking, okay, why aren't we doing more of this? What's keeping us from doing more of this? So, I mean, what's your take on that? Why aren't we doing more of what we know works for kids?
So, a reference point that I keep in my mind as I do my work is some of the kids that I worked with over the years. So I started as a middle school teacher and then taught high school. I actually met Kari because as a teacher at Bread and Roses, when we started that school, we asked the Brotherhood to come and start a chapter there because we knew that our kids needed that kind of support, and we learned a lot as we built that together. And I think as I went on to start my own school in the Bronx, the sort of lessons of those years as a teacher came back again and again to what the kids were saying today, that if kids are known well and if there's a sense that they are engaged in a real relationship with their teachers, then you can move them, and you can move them in powerful ways. And so what is it that supports that kind of relationship? Because ultimately, what's going on in the school system and in any school every day is the relationship between kids and teachers and what they're trying to learn. And that's the heart of it. And if a school isn't making that more successful, if a school system is not making that more successful, then we're wasting our time. And so the question is, what do you do to make that more successful? And one student I had, Ishmael Kamara, who came to us at Bronx International High School in our first year. He was a refugee from Sierra Leone. He had walked 300 miles with his grandmother from where their village was destroyed to a refugee center on the coast and managed to get, through the help of the UN, to the United States because he had a relative here. And he came to our school. He was in the country 7 days. Prior to that, he got there about 4 hours late because he had ended up in Queens because he wasn't sure how to use the subways yet and didn't speak English yet. And 4 years later, he was our valedictorian and got a Posse Foundation scholarship and went to college. And 4 years after that, he called me and said he wanted to be a teacher. And so we had just started a program with a network of the international schools where the strongest teachers in the schools were collaborating with university professors to train new teachers. Instead of sending teachers off to a sort of isolated program in a university, teachers were being trained in the schools. And these kinds of urban teacher residencies have started initially in Chicago and Boston. We have a couple of them going on in New York. And it's an opportunity to build talent and build leadership by drawing on the strengths of the schools that we've created. So Ishmael enrolled in that program, and he's now teaching at Bronx International. He's in his second year. And he decided to come back and do exactly what Kari was saying, you know, take what he learned and give back to the community that had helped him make those gains. And when I think about, well, what did we do in that school that inspired him to do that? We came into a building, Morris Campus, that was in 2001 taking in 700 kids a year and graduating 70 of them. And the first conversation I had was with the assistant principal for organization. He said, we've got 2 weeks left, and I've got 30 vacancies, and anyone with a pulse has got a job at this point because no one wants to come here. It's a two-fare zone, and it's just too hard to get any good teachers. And 6 months after that, when we started recruiting for the first 5 teachers for Bronx International, we had 500 applicants apply to go in that same building, in that same two-fare zone, to work with the students in the new school that we were creating in that campus for kids who had all failed the English language assessment, were learning English for the first time.
What explains that?
And I think that teachers are attracted to a sense of possibility. If there's leadership and if there's a sense that this is going to be a place where I'm going to get support and where I'm going to learn and where I can grow and I can actually succeed, because that's what we all want to do, right? Like, we all want to be in an environment where we can grow and push our limits and actually do a good job at what we've set out to do. And people recognize that. And part of what we did at Morris was we created an opportunity for a new group of teachers to come in and create something different and reinvent what school meant in that building. And so, you know, look at what's happening there. It's still a tough neighborhood. There's a lot of challenges that kids come with. But those same kids from that community now, across 4 schools in the building, there's a 75% graduation rate. And that's not good enough, because we have more work to do to get every kid to graduate and to make sure that they are the writers that Michelle was talking about. I hope we can come back to that point. But that's a powerful change that happened in that building. And we've actually seen that happen in lots and lots of buildings in this city. And we're nowhere close to where we need to be. But I think that we've unleashed a lot of innovation, a lot of talent, and a lot of sense of possibility, both for kids and for adults. And the public discourse around the work, as Fernanda was saying, gets very wrapped up into polarized politics. And I think that that's actually quite destructive to our collective understanding of what works and what we can do, because the people in this room, as you saw, a lot of them are teachers. Not all of them are teachers. Some are former principals. Some are superintendents. Some are network leaders. These are folks that are passionately working in our schools every day, doing amazing work. And that gets lost in the mix when the focus is on the latest power games.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna, what I'm doing now is I'm just going to throw out a few questions. Anybody wants to respond, please do. We can't get everybody to respond to every question, otherwise. But charter schools. Should we see charter schools as part of the solution, or should we be worried about the proliferation of charter schools? Where does it fit into the discourse about creating better schools for children in New York? Anyone?
Well, you know,
go ahead, Rich.
I'll step on a landmine maybe, but you know, I think we should absolutely look at charter schools as part of the solution. I think that we should absolutely be excited about any opportunity there is to create more educational options for more children.
Do you have any concerns about it?
Well, as I said, I would say two things. One is I would say that when I talk about a different idea about what is possible, I think we can't, for children, for low-income children, we can't have that conversation without talking about the extremely high achievement at some of the marquee charter schools in places like New York City. So I think politically they've contributed to that change and contributed to the idea that we can't use the poverty of our children as an excuse for not doing right by kids. And I think if you think about the idea that children need different paths and different doors and different options, charter schools are a way to create different paths and different options. Well, what I would say is, you know, we at the Children's Aid Society, we recently submitted an application to open our own charter school in the South Bronx, and we've been doing work in schools for a long time, obviously. We've never run a school before. The only thing that I would say is that what's important is that charter schools truly are a laboratory for innovation. And so long as the charter law allows organizations like Children's Aid, as well as large charter management organizations, to continue to innovate and to create new models of what education can mean for children, it's a wonderful thing. But I think doing that requires some change. You know, I talked about the barrier between early childhood and schools. You know, I'd like to open a charter school where the lottery can start at birth and we can begin educating children at birth according to what we've seen works and deliver real results. But we can't do that under the charter school law. So a mechanism that's designed to support innovation does not actually allow for true innovation in many ways. So that's sort of my knock at it. I would almost just want it to go further than the current charter law allows.
Anybody else want to comment? Concerns, reservations?
I want to go for it. Sorry, I did one of my first stories on the education beat was about a charter school that's opening in the Upper West Side, and you know I had a lot of. I mean that's an interesting place, but one thing that I remember very clearly hearing from people that got them upset about charter schools and people in District 3 who were not necessarily living in the immediate vicinity of that school was the idea of the co-location and how to a lot of them they felt just parents and some students in the traditional public school in the same building, they almost felt like there were two very separate worlds coexisting in the same building, because charter schools many times, if they have a big organization behind them, they have money, so they're able to renovate that part of the building and make improvements that the other side of the building doesn't always benefit from. And so it creates this sort of competitive environment that some people didn't like because it made the children feel different than the other children. And that's, you know, I'm sure the Office of Portfolio Planning at the DOE, you know, goes through very difficult decisions and finding, you know, determining what buildings schools should go and not go into. But I think that's one concern that a lot of people who go to the traditional schools in the buildings that also have charter schools have, and that they feel has not been truly addressed by the Department of Education.
Sharing a space. Lester, you would?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, we need good schools, whatever they are. However, the whole notion of institutionally sanctioned inequality that I think I just heard. I mean, what's needed is some leadership around ensuring that charter schools are actually the laboratories that everyone says that they should be. So, for example, if there are great charter schools operating, what are the variables that contribute to that greatness And then how does that get translated to other schools? And so if we know they have flexibility around staffing, if we know that there's flexibility around how they use the curriculum, the school day, the school year, then the real question becomes, what is the system's responsibility to ensure that more young people have access to that kind of structure? So what I would say is that what's needed is a different kind of leadership around the notion of charters. And if they're great, then they should be real partners with public schools.
And Michelle, you?
So I love Lester. Thank you. That was good. You and I have to talk. So I'm going to make 3 really quick points. One is some of my best friends are charter schools. However, the question is, how did the social justice movement become a kind of corporate campaign to undermine public education? So I hope you get your charter, and I'm sure you will do it well. And there are some fantastic charters. But there is also a campaign associated with a corporatization of the charter movement that even good charter educators are worried about. So it started as social justice, and now it's becoming a way of elbowing out a number of schools. There was an article yesterday about Castle Bridge getting bumped out of its space to grow space for KIPP Academy. So that's my first. I want to distinguish between charter schools and the corporate charter campaign, because they're not the same. Some of the first is lovely. A lot of the second is really problematic if you want public education. The second is the evidence on charters, you all probably know this, is pretty mixed. Most charter schools are mediocre. Lots are awful, and some are great. And they under-enroll special ed kids, and they under-enroll ELL kids, and they're more segregated than other schools. And the third is, if charters are going to be charters, then they've got to be public schools. They've got to, you can't say we don't take special education children. You can't say we don't take English language learners. And we have to hold them accountable for the push-out data are very, very hard to measure because when kids leave charter schools, they go back to the regular schools. So it doesn't look like a dropout. That doesn't happen with regular schools. So I've looked closely in New York and in New Jersey, and you can have 45 kids in the 9th grade, and then 60 in the 10th, and then 27 in the 11th, and then 45 in the 12th. So it looks like 100% persistence, and they're all going to college. But so we need a little more honesty around what the charters are doing. And I guess my last point is, just as Lester said, all schools need to be more innovative. All schools need, there are plenty of fantastically innovative
What does that mean to you, be innovative?
Public schools. They need a little more flexibility. If he wants to do early child care, he should be able to do that. If people want to bring in after-school services, if schools have vowed to do serious assessment in a variety of ways but are willing to be held accountable and transparent, we should invite innovation in all schools and not presume that just these little experiments can be innovative and the rest are getting choked with rules that are making it impossible to be innovative. So I'm all for charter schools if they're going to be public.
All right, so,
Can I just
okay,
wait
so I
on
didn't
that?
want to have to answer that one.
So, 2 thoughts. In New York City, in the past 8 years, there have been 500 new schools opened. Of those 500, about 20% were charter schools. Mm-hmm. And the other 80% were regular district schools. Both are public schools. The big difference between a charter school and a district school is their connection to the district and also their connection to the union. And so the regulatory environment that shapes the decisions that a charter school leader and their staff make is quite different. And Michelle is correct that it does not guarantee success to have more autonomy. It is one of the options that can lead to very powerful success, though.
Exactly.
And so if you do it well, you can get really powerful gains. One of the things that New York City has done in a pretty intentional way is invest in creating lots of internal district schools that are new schools that are trying to take advantage of that same kind of innovation. So the schools that I mentioned earlier that I had been involved with are 2 of those, but there are hundreds of them, and not every single one of them is good either. But for the most part, they are powerful learning environments. And I think we need to struggle with the question of what kinds of autonomy do school leaders and their faculty need. And I think there are real constraints that exist right now within both the connection to the district, how much we can actually free people up to do what they want to do. So you just mentioned assessment as an example. The state regulates assessment. So while we have the Performance Standards Consortium that is a powerful model for performance assessment, it is limited to 30 schools or so in the city, and they want to expand, but they need permission to do that from the state. And we couldn't, even if we wanted to, give them that permission. And I think the same is true around something like a longer school day. So part of the reason that charter schools can do a longer school day and a longer school year is they don't have the same bounds of the UFD contract. And they get to negotiate that with their faculty, and that has pros and cons. There are a lot of important protections that come with a contract, but there are also, it's a generalized set of rules for 1,700 schools that's not going to be right in every situation. And the flexibility that you need to kind of get to, let's say, a 200-day year, if you negotiate that at the contract level, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that needs to be invested in New York City in order to get that 200-day year. It's not just a regulatory change. And so how do you balance those two things?
So I don't want to stick on the charters too long, but go ahead.
Shell and I remember when you started teaching at Crossroads. I don't mean to do that age thing, but and Shale's been an amazing educator, and people are so happy that he is at the Board of Ed because he's a trusted educator. But what I hear from some of the new small schools is we suddenly are getting all of these overage kids, right? And I don't really like when we talk about kids, but high need, not very well educated yet, etc. Kind of all of a sudden get placed in our schools, and then we get declared a failure. So is that kind of permeability present for the charters? Do they get large numbers of young people who haven't been admitted with lottery and interviews? And
What some call the over-the-counter kids who show up throughout the year.
I think it's a good question. So two things on that. One is there's a need within the system between the new schools and the existing schools to create a balance there, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the criticisms has been that the older schools bear a heavier burden than the newer schools in terms of admissions. And then there's a separate set of questions around how does that connect to charters. And the way the state law is written is that charter must be done via a lottery. And the lottery becomes a screen in a sense because who knows how to get into the lottery. It's not necessarily hard to do once you know about it, but you have to know about it. And and if you don't speak English, how are you going to find out if there isn't active outreach around that? And I think there are a number of charter schools that have made it their mission to go out and recruit in communities that are underrepresented. But it is actually, and we had a few years ago a group that wanted to start an autism charter school that wanted to intentionally select the most severely disabled kids. And we eventually got it started, but we spent 4 months fighting then, a different administration, the state ed department, over the ability to select the weakest, highest need kids because the lottery didn't allow for that in the law. And we eventually found loopholes in the law that permitted them to do it. But it was literally tooth and nail, and it almost didn't get approved. And so I think there really are things that could quite simply be changed in the regulatory environment that would create greater sense of equity around the issues you're raising.
What should we be doing? Fernando, you were talking about this before, about the concerns of immigrant parents and the fact that they don't know how to negotiate choice in New York City. And their kids are often being denied access to not just charters, but to lots of other schools in New York. What should we be thinking about for this changing population?
First, from a reporter's perspective, when you look at the stories, for example, the Times covers, a lot of it comes from pressure that we get from very engaged parents. And most of the very engaged parents are in some of the more well-to-do families, neighborhoods, the best schools in the city. And that's part of the reason why these schools got to be so great, because the parents are very, very involved. And we were talking about a story that that I've been I'm starting to work on around the whole issue of wait lists for kindergarten. I was curious when I did a little story for Saturday's paper. I said, you know, how about District 24, Corona, Jackson Heights? I know it's a very crowded part of the city. So can you give me an example of a school there that has a wait list? And, you know, there's one school that, I forget the number, but it's a school that has had a wait list this year, is going to have, you know, has a wait list for the next school year that's bigger than the previous year, and it's been a problem for several years. And I started getting curious about it, and the panel for educational policy in April is going to vote on resitting a 5th grade class of an elementary school in Columbia. So it's 3 classes, 3 sections of 5th grade that were pushed out of a building in Corona because the school had to make room for more kids coming in. So these 5th grade kids are in an annex building. But now the school that's in the annex has grown to the point that there's no room to accommodate these 3 5th grade classes from this first school. So these kids are pushed to yet another school. So this principal is now in charge, is going to be in charge of kids who are 1.5 miles away. And this is happening in our city. You know, these are the schools our taxes partly, you know, our taxes paid for. And those are the kids who may not be our kids, but, you know, and I say that in the times, right? But maybe they're the kids of the nannies who take care of our kids, you know? And so it's all connected. And so, you know, the whole idea of making school better for immigrants has a lot to do with making the families more part of the schools. But of course that is, you know, I don't want to, you are probably much better to talk about that, because I'm sure there are humongous challenges from every standpoint, starting from the fact that a lot of them don't speak English, or they come from a country like my country. Even though I'm educated, I speak English, my school system is very different than this school system. So it's very hard for people to even understand what it means to go to school here. So, you know, it's very difficult, and I'm glad that I just write about it.
All right. Well, so this issue, it also has bearing on these international rankings. And we know that every few years they get new reports about how the United States is doing in comparison to other countries, and they always show us falling further behind. But when you break the data down and you start to notice, well, actually, it's not all kids that are falling behind, because affluent white kids are really doing quite well. They're doing almost as well as any other kids in the world, including the highest performing countries. It's really poor children of color, especially, that are actually bringing the whole country down. But I'm wondering, because that, to me, seems to be the issue we're not dealing with, the issue of poverty and inequality, right? And the fact that we live in this country where there are these profound and deep inequities related to educational opportunity. And what should we, I mean, you know, 20 Children's Aid Society schools are nice, but not even a drop in the bucket for New York City, much less the country. What should we be doing? What should the president, if we could get the president or the Congress to listen, what should we be doing to take this on?
Well, look, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I'll just start with saying that fundamentally a political problem which has political solutions, and it begins with the way that we finance education, which is fragmented, which is tied irrevocably to the economic capacity and the political power of communities and their schools. I think, you know, so one thing I will just say is that this country's fetishization of local school control damages our ability to have a truly equitable school system. So I'll start with that.
I mean, I would say right now we have a very good case study in what's going on in the New York State budget. So we just heard about overcrowding in Queens, and the state has cut by more than 30% the capital budget that would fund construction of new schools, and is also dramatically cutting into the operating budget. And this is under a Democratic governor with the support of a Democratic assembly, and it seems to be that the sort of broader political ambitions of our governor are pushing towards a set of solutions to this problem that don't actually focus on what do the schools have what they need. And I think that it's been really tough to get traction, and I think that's a challenge to all of us.
If you had the ear of the governor and he said, look, I got to cut this money somewhere, what would you say?
Well, I think he ran on a platform that said that he couldn't raise taxes, and so that puts him in a box. You know, that's the challenge.
But I think to be fair, I mean, that applies to your boss's boss as well, in the city of New York.
True.
And again, we're talking about equity. There is something fundamentally un-American about the idea that at a time when people are talking about shared sacrifice, that one of the things that would not be on the table as we face, and I have to say I come here from a meeting where I left my 100 managers talking about the $6.3 million of budget cuts we're facing with the Children's Aid Society, is that in cuts that are really affecting the most disenfranchised children in ways that you can't possibly imagine. You know, we've cut programs for sexually active middle school girls that were effective because we don't have the money to do them anymore. When you're facing that kind of fundamental disconnect, and we can't talk about asking the wealthiest among us, which I'm happy to include myself in, to make modest increases in their contribution to taxes, when that's not on the agenda, it's very difficult to have any realistic conversation about equity because we need more money. We can't cut our way. We're certainly not going to cut our way to being competitive in education internationally. We're not going to cut our way to equity for poor children.
Lester?
Yeah, I also think that it's how you define the problem, how you look at the problem. Richard said earlier this whole notion of will, and you said that it's the young people of color that are really holding the country behind. I mean, the real question becomes, why is that all right? What's happening, what I think is happening, is that it's become acceptable, right? It's all right as long as it's these kids, and I think that if you look at the budget conversation, I mean, look, we can't get more money for universal pre-K because of the prison budget, and so it's easier for us to add money to build prisons. I mean, what was the deal was they're going to reduce it by X number of beds, but that's ridiculous. I mean, we know that there are juvenile detention centers in upstate that are empty, and so we can't close them, right? But we can cut the education budget, and so ultimately the question becomes, why is it all right for that condition to exist for this population? You know, when are we going to get angry about that? So I think that, yeah, there needs to be a different political action, but that's not going to happen without the people getting behind that, right? More people have to be concerned about these conditions and address it I'm not preaching revolution, folks, but however, I mean, unless we get angry about this, unless we talk about these conditions, I mean, nothing's going to happen because we see it every day. I mean, we were talking a minute ago about charters. I had the experience of meeting with all the charter providers in New York State, and I asked them a very simple question. We've got a challenge in New York around middle schools and high schools, and I asked them, how many of you would be willing to open up a charter high school in a high-need community? No one raised their hand, not one. So part of what I'm concerned about is when we start small schools, when we start charter schools, what about the youngsters who don't get to go to those small schools? What about all the youngsters that are still in these large schools that don't have the kind of leadership and the support? What about, I mean, this, and again, this is, you know, we're having a conversation. But when we phase out, what happens to those youngsters that we're phasing out? Where do they end up? Because I understand that if they're not fortunate enough to get into Brotherhood or Sister Soul or get into a good small school, they go into the underground economy. And then they go into the prisons. And so I think ultimately, the real question is, do we have the will to think about all of the children? Do we value all of our young people?
So I want to open it up to the audience in a moment, but I want to bring it back to Brothers and Sisters Soul as the group that brought us together tonight, because they've been showing that even in schools that may be deeply flawed, right, that if you provide young people with good support outside of school, you can almost compensate, almost, for what the schools haven't done. And I think what it speaks to is that we need a safety net for young people in New York City, that we need to get other nonprofits, churches, other groups throughout the businesses. We act like we're in a third world country. We have Wall Street is in New York. We have some of the wealthiest people in the world. Their addresses are right here. What's going on that we can't find ways to get this support system in place for a greater number of young people? Why are we only thinking about, I mean, it's true we have a big political problem with the state, but why are we limited to thinking about what the state provides and not the vast wealth that Goldman Sachs controls and others like it?
I agree. I'm working on it.
You're working on it.
So
Michelle?
We might come out on the bottom and international comparisons, but we come out on the top in inequality gaps. So the United States, if you look at, there's a wonderful book called The Spirit Level that looks at how inequality gaps are killing us, right? And it's actually not the percentage of people in poverty that's highly related to negative outcomes. It's the gap between the top and the bottom, right? And the United States is among the highest with like Singapore. And then New York State is among the highest within the states, and then New York City within New York State. So it's those inequality gaps, and that's related to incarceration, it's related to unemployment, it's related to teen pregnancy, it's related to mortality, it's related to voting, it's related to how well we take care of our children, right? And so I think we need to think about this not as those kids are bringing us down, but inequality gaps are killing us. And I also want to make a point about the power of Brotherhood, Sister Soul, and youth organizations. We did this citywide youth survey. It was young people created. It was called Polling for Justice. Young people created a survey that young people answered, 1,200 kids, on their experiences of education, criminal justice, health care, and housing, right? And we looked at what we call dispossession. Who are the kids who are really suffering in education? Too much involvement with the police. In some neighborhoods, as you know, it's absolutely out of control, not necessarily because of what kids are doing. Who doesn't have health care? And so we have a group of kids who are highly dispossessed. And they're much more likely to engage in unsafe sex and be depressed and other risks unless they're in a youth organization. And it's like this amazing finding, or unless they feel like they have a teacher they trust. So it's like a buffer around young people that even when the toxic air of dispossession occurs, organizations like Brotherhood, Sister Soul, like Educational Video Center, I'm sure there are other friends in the audience who I should be advertising, they are a little umbrella in unbelievably toxic times. And so the assault doesn't move right under the skin, right? And so we need to be thinking about public and private monies to help support those, even as we are continually working on schools, because without neighborhood-based youth organizations that are assets-based, and community service is the same, right? We're just watching the toxic air go right under the skin of young people, and if they don't end up in criminal justice facilities, they end up sick.
I think I'd like to sort of push on an assumption I hear underneath the conversation, though, which is that we're not making progress. And I think that as challenging as the problem is, I think we actually are making progress. And so the achievement gap right now in New York City for graduation rates between Black and Latino kids and white and Asian kids is about 23 points. Something like 50% of Black and Latino kids are graduating versus 73 point white and Asian. And if you look at that, that's absolutely unacceptable. If you look back 5 years ago, the graduation rate was about 30% for Black and Latino kids. And the gap was something on the order of 27, 28 between. Now both groups have gone up. The gap has closed by about 5 points, or 20% of the gap. And so that's not very good, but it actually is almost double the number of the kids graduating. L kids were graduating 5 years ago at the rate of around 26%, and they're now at 44%. That's a huge change. More and more kids are actually succeeding. Now, what does it mean to graduate? That's a question we haven't talked about. You asked about raising the standards. The regents are right now talking about raising the standards by changing the cut scores on the regents exam, which all that does is distract schools from the real work of engaging kids, as opposed to actually changing the regents exams and starting to introduce much more authentic forms of assessment where kids are doing the kind of writing that Michelle was talking about. That kind of rigor is what you see happening in those countries that we're competing with. Right. In Singapore, in Finland, the kinds of assignments that kids are being given in school push their thinking and ask them to engage at a different level. And we continue to be in an environment where we're playing with, you know, is it a 65 or a 75 on a test that isn't actually pushing on the skills that kids need to compete. And kids, you know, will engage. You know, kids like to work and like to write and like to read, but you need to challenge them. You need to actually ask them to do something real. And if you have a set of assessments that is at the end state, this is the thing you have to do to graduate, that don't do that, then everything behind it is not going to do that.
All right, we're going to come up to the audience and see if there's any questions for the panel. I'm going to really ask that it's a question, not a statement, and that it would be even more helpful if you have it directed at a particular member of the panel. And there are mics on the side, but if you have a loud voice and you're in the middle. Yes, way in the back.
Where is technology fitting into the plans for Brosis? Where's technology fitting into the plans that you have for trying to close the gap, and especially for trying to get us out of high school graduation towards college access and success?
Good question. So one of the possibilities that technology now presents is an opportunity to individualize learning experiences and connect it to where a kid actually is. So if you imagine the classroom that I think one of the kids in the video described with, you know, kids at very, very different stages of development in the same classroom, and how does the teacher figure this out? If you're a teacher, you know that that is probably the hardest thing about being a teacher, is trying to bridge all of those different needs. And if you can create a system that's more based on mastery, where kids are actually, instead of us thinking about everyone trying to get to the exact same point, having a set of assignments where kids are working at their own pace and are demonstrating mastery at different stages of their development, then you start to create opportunities for a lot more entry points into the curriculum. And technology is a tool that can start to allow for that, because you can create both access to content, access to ways to demonstrate that mastery, opportunities for kids to collaborate with people who aren't in the same room as them.
So why are we taking their cell phones and their iPods away from?
It's a good question. That's a good question.
Over here.
I'm a graduate student here in New York City, and I've been thinking about a question for a while, which is, how do we develop a multi-layer system of accountability? So I think we have this interesting panel up here that represents several sectors in education, with the Department of Education, media, researchers, community-based organizations, policymakers. How would you each say that you think your sector holds itself, or you think it should hold itself accountable for school success?
Anybody?
I can take it if you want.
That's
I don't want to be the only one talking.
Well, we put it on. Let's give somebody else a chance to shout at that. How should the state be held accountable?
Yeah,
you let it out before last. So you said we're raising the standards, and we might expect more kids. What's the state's accountability?
I actually, I struggle with that. I think that we should be held accountable based on the outcomes of the students in the state. I think, and I want to, if I could just say a little bit about what Shale said. I actually think that the former New York City leadership and I have every expectation that the current New York City leadership has had a huge impact on achievement in New York City. I think that for the first time, there was a real focus that achievement was the school's responsibility and not that we create excuses. And so I thought it was a good thing that schools felt the heat for student achievement. Right? What I would say after that, though, is it's like the difference between the truth and the whole truth. The truth is, yes, scores have gone up. The truth is that graduation rates have gone up. But the whole truth was, as was reported, that the graduation numbers didn't mean anything if CUNY community colleges had a 70% dropout rate. I mean, it doesn't matter if kids are hitting the score if they can't translate that into success at the next level. So I think that we, the Board of Regents, have some ownership on that. I think everyone has to own this problem, but we can't shy away from having the conversation. So ultimately, the business of school is learning, and I think as a policy board, we ought to be accountable for the equitable distribution of outcomes and ensuring that all young people are progressing. That's what we should be. That's what I want to be held accountable.
Renata, do you want to address the accountability question?
Well, yeah, from the media standpoint, our role in that is making sure that the people, the different elements that make this whole system, when they say that they are going to do something, that they actually do it, and that whenever they do something and whatever results it is that they said that project, that initiative accomplished, that indeed it is something that was true for everybody, not just for a small group of students. And more specifically, I think that it's about showing to readers that the different aspects of the system and how it plays out in different parts of the city, in different neighborhoods, in places where family dynamics are different, in places where income levels are different. And that's a big challenge, but that's one that we always have to make sure we meet, because if we don't do that, then the people who base their idea of the city's education system or any city's education system on what they read in the newspaper will never really understand how exactly it is that things happen on the ground, on the day-to-day lives of the different schools and students who go to these schools.
I think one thing that community-based organizations can offer, I hope, is helping us all focus on the complexities of children as human beings, and this came up in the video as well. We can help to continue to push the dialogue to say that we need to be concerned, of course, with whether young people demonstrate mastery of academic skills. That's critical. But we also have to be focused as a system and as a society on young people's healthy development, their intellectual development, their personal development. And unless we are really concerned with developing all aspects of the human being, we're not going to have human beings who can be able citizens in the world, which require skills. Well, you got to be able to read and write, but it requires skills in addition to reading and writing and arithmetic as well. And so I hope that we in my world can continue to push that idea forward. I partially, I felt like I wanted to depth the question by asking another question, which is, and student assessment is not my expertise, but sometimes I just feel like it's really at the end of the day a question of money. Like standardized bubble testing is cheap. Because people can fill in the bubble and you can put it in the machine and you get a number back. And the kind of assessments that we're talking about is a much more expensive undertaking. And so maybe to some extent it just still goes back to questions of political resources and political will. Do we actually care about understanding whether a 7-year-old has the skills, the assets, I should say, the ability to work, play with others, to learn, to all the assets that you need to be successful. Are we really interested in actually assessing that? Or will we only be focused on doing the easiest assessments? You know, people always talk about teaching to the test and it being a bad thing, which also always struck me as weird. It seems like teaching to the test is a good thing, so long as the test is right. If the test is right, then you should be teaching to the test, but it should be measuring the things you want a child, the things you want a child to have. And I just wonder whether we'd all have, you know, if we can't solve all these other problems, I wonder, are we going to actually invest the resources in the kind of assessment paradigm that we're talking about?
So
I just want to get a couple more hands. Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Michelle. Go.
Hi. There's so much talent in the city around, in the country around education, and I'm curious how the Department of Education is engaging and collaborating with educational leaders and innovators that are interested in making a contribution in your space. And is there think tanking going on? I mean, I'm outside of what you do. Is there that kind of work being done with those who are making an impact, and how are you leveraging this talent that's out there?
I agree. I think both inside and outside of the system, New York City has the best educators. I mean, when you talk to people who work around the country, and they say, you're so lucky, the teachers that you have in New York City. And I think that is something that we don't realize, those of us who've come up in this system, just how powerful the educators are. The most significant way that I see external groups partnering effectively is by actually working on schools. You know, whether it's starting a school or partnering with and helping to develop schools, that where the rubber hits the road is in the classroom. And there can be great ideas, but most great ideas, once you start trying to work them through, change a lot once they're tested in terms of engaging kids and engaging the educators who have to work with them. And so whenever I encounter someone strong who is interested in getting involved, I'm like, okay, so you want to start a school, you want to work with some schools, like this is what we need.
Barbara. Former principal.
Hi. Lester, I agree with you that it's important to hold schools accountable for how the students are doing, but this question's for Shell. Shell, every single year, the progress reports have been changed, recalibrated, and now you're doing it again. We also discovered that the test scores that were questionable, that were used for those progress reports, and this constant change and reference to the progress reports, I wonder if it's not distracting people from really doing the things that are important for children. So can you explain why you put so much energy in this constant quest to change and reassess a progress report, and how are we supposed to feel confident that this has any value at all?
Well, you were.
All right. Yeah. Well,
but Barbara, I recall you being really happy when your school got an A. I remember that.
So here's the challenge. I was looking at some of the old reports from the 90s and found, you know, a set from 95, 96, 97. And these were like the Board of Ed's old annual reports. No mention in anywhere. There was school overcrowding listed, there was capacity, number of lunches, number of suspensions, nothing about kids learning. And the fact that we all know what the progress report is and care about how it changes is a testament to the fact that it actually matters a lot to schools and to educators in schools now, whether or not the kids in their school are learning. And so that is a powerful cultural change. Now, there were always great educators out there in the system who came to the problem with the kind of accountability and the sense of responsibility that Michelle was talking about. But there are also many, many places which were just places of neglect, where nothing was happening, where they were dead zones. You would walk into the classroom, and the teacher was bored, and the kid was bored, and the principal was in their office, and nothing was happening. And so the fact that we're having a conversation in this city about accountability is a testament to the power of trying to measure it. Now, how do you measure it well? So this year, 2 big changes to the progress report we're making. We're starting to ask for teachers' grades in the middle schools because people have raised a lot of concerns that the progress report for elementary and middle school is just based on 2 high-stakes exams. So what other kinds of data can we use that's not just high-stakes exams? At the high schools, we've been using teachers' grades very effectively. So we want to explore doing that at the middle school and at the elementary school. That changes the balance of what is being measured and takes some pressure off of the test as the only way to evaluate. Is that a good change? Yeah, it's a change, but it's in response to real feedback and real concerns that people have had. Another thing is we're starting to measure how many kids, when they leave high school, are actually college ready by the standards that Lester was talking about. That is clearly a concern. We've gone from a flat graduation rate for decades, right around 50, to a graduation rate of right around 63%. That's progress, but it's nothing to write home about. In CUNY, they're bursting at the seams because there's now, instead of 16,000 kids going to CUNY from New York, 25,000. Most of those kids are Black and Latino kids who are now graduating instead of dropping out. So that progress report has helped to push that, but now we have to measure, are they ready? And it's an important thing to figure out because if schools aren't thinking about that, then they aren't going to push their kids in the same way. And so I don't think we had it perfect. I don't think we still have it perfect. And yeah, it's challenging to go through a process where things are changing, but would you rather have a situation where principals, educators, other folks from the community are giving feedback and we say, well, sorry, we can't change it because otherwise it's going to be too disruptive. That's the challenge.
But on this point of measurement, though, and this is where I want to go back to Fernanda on this. 2 years ago, the DOE rated over 80% of the schools in New York as A's or B's, which seemed quite odd, especially because it coincided with Mayor Bloomberg's quest for a 3rd term, right? And it was only after the election that we found out, lo and behold, we aren't all above average. In fact, many are not even close.
Okay, so
no, okay, but I want to ask Fernanda, okay, why didn't that story come out before the election? Why didn't we know before the election that, talking about accountability, that things weren't as rosy as, I mean, I think Shell's right, there's been progress, but I think there's been exaggeration, too, about how much progress has been.
Well, part of the reason was that the grades and the progress reports that came after the one where 80% of the school got A's were very different than those, and I believe they came after the quest for 3rd term, the push for the legislative change and all that. So it's just an issue of timing. And
the timing sure worked out really well.
Well, then you know, it's not so much a question for, I mean, we don't set the timing, right? We kind of work with what we've got.
But that's what I'm getting at, the probing that I think only the media can do. That because we're counting on you, right, as the lay public.
Look, there's a lot of, you know, there are a lot of questions we have about a lot of different aspects, even of the way things are measured these days. You know, not to say that I also believe there has been progress and changes, and some of it is evidenced by the fact that many families that in the past, middle-class families who would leave New York City because they want a better school for their kids, they stay in the city, and they're, you know, the schools in, I live in Windsor Terrace, and one school, not the one I'm zoned for, thankfully, but you know, the other school in my district, I mean, it's like getting to where I live, you know what I mean? Like, people are staying, they want their kids to go to school, they believe in public schools more than I think they did 10 years ago. But, you know, it is, the political forces are very, very strong, and between what you're saying to me, which is something that a lot of us reporters and other people have asked, and using that and actually writing a story, you have to have real proof that there was political, you know, architecturing behind the scenes to make things happen the way they did. And you know, and that's very difficult. But it's not for lack of trying. I mean, I think we have been successful in some ways in showing some of the problems. You know, sometimes the DOE gets very upset at us. Sometimes I think also there is a push to always finding problems with things when there's a lot of gray that gets lost, you know, and it has to do with the fact that sometimes the editors are not as invested in the beats as the reporters are. So my conversations with Shale are much deeper than the ones I have with my editor, and he hears that one thing that he goes, that's it, we're going to write the story that's, you know, and you're like, no, well, wait, there's more, you know. So it's very difficult, and there are a lot of forces, not just, you know, in Shale's world, in Mayor Bloomberg's world, but my world too. There's a lot of politics in my world too.
Sure.
So, you know, we all work towards getting to the whole truth, as you know, Mr. Young said. But it's, you know, it's difficult.
Okay. Did you want to say anything, Shale?
Yeah. Well, just in defense of the press at that point in time when we released those grades, we were pretty strongly criticized and attacked the next day. And people asked exactly that question. And this was about 2 months into the job for me. And so it was actually one of the first hard decisions I had to make. The test scores had gone up dramatically that June as a result of how the state was scoring the tests, which was outside of our control. We had said to principals, if you get to 70, that's an A. And that was, like, to her point, we had made that commitment in November. That's what everyone was shooting for. And it just, everyone got to 70. And so the question was, do we change the rules, you know, after having made that commitment to principals and give a more sort of realistic picture? Because we didn't think 84% of the schools were A's. But at the same time, we had said, this is what you have to do. And we decided, you know what? We said that to principals. We got to stick with that. And we did. And we were deeply criticized for it because it didn't give a full picture, but it turned out that the reason why that happened had nothing to do with our system or something we were controlling. It was the way the state was scoring the exams. And that, again, you know, maybe there were political things at play, but when the Times investigated that and, like, dug in and tried to figure out what had really happened, it came down to the fact that it's actually really complicated to do that well. And to your point, we aren't spending the resources that we need to do it well often. And so we were getting what we paid for.
You want to say something, Michelle?
Oh, so much. This testing infrastructure we've created is extremely expensive. Please don't spend more on it. We could, in fact, sample schools, right? We don't have to test every child multiple times a year. We're not learning that much about change. Right, so we could move to sampling. We could have more school-based, thick notions of accountability where we find out to what extent do students feel respected, to what extent do teachers trust their schools, to what extent do parents feel welcome, what does student work look like. There's a long history in New York of doing much deeper, close looks within schools and then randomly testing children. Why don't we move toward sampling rather than doing all of the testing that we're doing where the stakes are so high for kids and for teachers and now for schools?
So
that's a real question.
All right, but there's one last question of the night, and Kari's has a real love of his brother. He said he wants his brother to get that question, so.
It was said earlier that one of the most important elements to whether a child succeeds is if they have an organization like Brotherhood Sister Soul, a community-based organization. A lot has been talked about money and what things cost and how much has to happen for legislative change. So what was just mentioned is how expensive the testing is. If you tested every other school, would you be able to put a staff running the Brotherhood Sister Soul model in the schools that are at most at risk, 5 or 6 people, that will then bring up those schools that are at such risk? I'm not sure what the expenses are. I have no idea. I'm not in your business. But I'm just asking, are there other ways to use that money in the areas where the risk is highest than a test? And what was just mentioned was sampling. Is it possible to change the direction of the thinking so that you're taking more community-based, organized efforts to improve children's education than than testing?
I have a chance for one brief response to that. Anybody?
I think
Sounds
we should
like
just vote.
Vote. Good.
So testing is expensive, but it's not on the order of what you would need to get brotherhood in half of our schools. That said, there are resources that I don't think we're using as well as we could that may be redirected. And I do think that it's not actually an either-or, that you do need a way to, in a healthy way, measure how kids are doing. And I think sampling is a good idea. It happens to run against federal law right now. Right. Federal law requires that we test every kid. Until we change that law, we can't sample. But I think you're right to ask the question, where should the resources come from to provide that kind of youth development?
So President Obama said something very interesting yesterday about testing, about the fact that it should be used for diagnostic purposes and not merely for ranking purposes. I think that hopefully that is more than just a statement that is actually going to become reflected in policy. Let's thank the panelists for...
So just a closing thought from the Brotherhood Sister Soul before we move on. There will be a reception afterwards, so in about 5 minutes with the panelists right adjacent with hors d'oeuvres, appetizers, drinks, etc. So we encourage you to stay around. But we started this evening with the voices of our young people through the video. And I think in the same refrain, we'd want to kind of end with the Brotherhood Sister Soul model, which is just posing questions. You know, we talk a lot at Brotherhood Sister Soul about what it means to be a man and a woman. We help young people define these things, an ethical and moral code for their life. And we don't do it in a didactic way. We don't come in and tell them what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. But we ask of them the question, and then the answers produce their path, right? And so at Brotherhood Sister Soul, we would argue that an education, an equal education, a common education, is not a service to be cut by the state or by the city, but it's a right. It's a social justice issue that all of our young people, regardless of class, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of the zip code they were born into, has a right to education. And so if this, the wealthiest city, as many people have talked about, that isn't happening, our question to our young people would be why? If the state chooses not to raise taxes on the wealthiest, as many panelists talked about, but instead chooses to cut our educational system, the question would be why? On this panel, we have some of the most powerful people in education, not to put anybody on the spot, but from a state level, a city level, educators, community-based organizations, the most powerful newspaper in the world. If this is a social justice issue, and it seems that all on the panel would agree, and that our young people are being educated in a way that is both unconstitutional and inhumane, where is the sense of outrage? Where is the language of justice? And so as we talk about these issues with our young people, we try to pose the questions to them in that way, and also really looking at the numbers. Why do we, as a state, spend $200,000 a year to incarcerate a child? And in the city of New York, roughly $15,000 to $16,000 in most schools to educate a child. Why that disparity of resources? One panelist talked about prison beds being kept open even though no one is in them, and yet we have schools where we do not have enough seats for children. Why is that? We talk a lot about charter schools. Harlem, where Brotherhood Sister Soul exists, is the epicenter of the charter school movement. And while there are certainly some good charters, the question again becomes, where's the accountability for the charter school systems? So what we mean is not educators, not the people like Rich, who I hope gets his charter, not the people who are committed to the issue of educating our young people, but the massive systems that Michelle talked about that oversee the creation of charters. When they come into our community in Harlem and create charter schools across the board, to Michelle's point, these are not things we're just making up. You can look at the Credo study or the recent study out of Colorado, the vast majority of which are poor schools. What happens to those institutional funders? Where is their accountability? If young people are given a test, if teachers are held accountable, if some principals are held accountable, where are the multi-billion-dollar institutions' accountability when their schools fail and then they move on to a new district or new community and create new schools, and our children are the guinea pigs in those schools? So there's so many educators in this room. They're policy people. They're the highest level of education, of government. All sectors are represented. And so if we frame this issue as a social justice issue as we look at it, we train our young people to be community organizers, to seek change, that their voices matter. What we would say to the audience, what we would say to the panelists is, as we leave tonight, from the very powerful comments from our panelists, from the powerful voices from our young people, we hope that it inspires people to frame it in that way, that this is a social justice issue, a human rights issue, we would argue the preeminent civil rights issue of the day. And if we look at it from that lens, that maybe it will activate us a little more, it will push us to ask the tougher questions, it will push us to speak out in the many collegial meetings we have, because every single year that these numbers occur, and even if we look at the fact that 60% are now graduating, whereas it used to be 50, if we take that as the number, 40% is an abomination when we look at it as a rate of failure. And this mayor said 10 years ago to hold him accountable. He didn't say hold him accountable for mediocrity. He said hold him accountable for systemic change. We're still at 40% failure. And so the people who feel that, quite honestly, most directly, are not those of us up here, but it's the young people in the audience, the members of the Brotherhood Sister Soul, who every single day deal with that lived reality in all too many of their schools. And so I think we owe it to them, to the young people whose voices we heard in this video today, to really speak out on this issue as we go back to our institutions, to the government sectors we work at, and really look at this issue as what it is, from the Brotherhood Sister Soul's perspective, a social justice and a human rights issue. And so we thank you all for coming tonight. We hope you look at it from that perspective as you leave. Again, there will be a reception next door. Before we leave, please, one last round of applause for our panelists, for our moderator. We appreciate your time so much. These are all exceedingly busy people who are involved in this issue every single day, and your involvement here tonight really means a tremendous amount. We thank you for your honesty and your commitment.